Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to Abbeycwmhir. And we will do a little tour around, a little peregrination around the village, looking at various buildings, considering their history, how they came to be here, what purpose they fulfilled, and where we are with them today. But obviously this is the centre of the village. Abbeycwmhir has a long history with the Abbey, which we shall look at later, going back to medieval times, and also a lot more modern history and big estates, and now much smaller estates or no estates at all, as they have disappeared over the years. And inevitably the families that ran the estates are the people who have left a mark on the landscape. We always try to look at landscape history as someone was there before you. All right, there was always somebody a little bit further back and a bit further back and a bit further back, and that's how we build history. And very often it's good to learn history not from dates way back up to the present day, but look at the present day and work backwards, because that's sometimes much more illuminating. Anyway, this is the centre of the village. You're standing on what appears to be a car park at the moment, known locally as the square. It's fairly typical of the Abbey, it's anything but a square. And it used to have a totally different purpose to what its function is today. We look at this building here, which actually used to be the school. It's known, its proper name is Cross Cottage, but if you look at it, you could see perhaps some ideas of the architecture, the big windows, the high windows on the ground floor, which are very typical of a Victorian school. So this was the first school that was built in the village, and standards of literacy were not terribly good in the 1850s when that was built, and the earlier times. It's interesting to look at the parish registers, which we have some copies in the church, and discover the number of people who have signed the register for their marriage with a cross, and somebody else has written by Mary Jones her mark. People were really fairly illiterate because there was no national education system. So this building was originally erected by Francis Aspinall Phillips, who was the first of the Phillips family to own the estate. Most people, when they think of Abbeycwmhir and their estates, think of the Phillips, but they were the most recent long-term landowners in this area. And if you look up on the gable there, you can see a little bearing, and it says F.A.P. Francis Aspinall Phillips, and the date under this is 1858. And that was the building of that particular school, first school in the area. 1857 even, right. I think my crib notes, which Aggie's got, to say something like that. Anyway, there we were. And there's a little bit of hidden history with the Phillips family. They were mill owners in Stockport, Greater Manchester as it is now, and they had considerable money that they had made out of the business of producing cotton goods of one sort or another, and they were also specialists in producing ribbon. But it created a lot of wealth for the family. And if you were an industrialist in the 19th century, a mark of your success was to have a big country estate. And it just so happened that in the 1830s, land was for sale here because the previous owner of estate lands here had gone bankrupt. We'll talk about more that later on. So we have the Phillips family arriving on the scene in 1837. But the hidden history lies partly with the father of Francis Aspinall Phillips, Francis Phillips, of a previous generation, who was very well connected, again a mill owner, and he witnessed two interesting events in the around 1810, 1820. In 1812, Francis Phillips happened to be in the House of Commons in London, not the House of Commons, not the House of Parliament that we have today. That was a little bit later, I think. And he was present when an attack took place on the then British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval. And Perceval was the only, fortunately, the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated. And Francis Phillips was present when that attack took place. He intervened with others. They apprehended the assailant and also made attempts to apply first aid and save Spencer Perceval's life. Unfortunately, for Perceval anyway, they failed in that. One might feel like assassinating British Prime Ministers from time to time, but that was the only... I didn't say that. But there we were. Okay, so that was one thing that he was involved with. It's living history. One of the things that we've been doing recently with the Abbeycwmhir Trust is looking at what we call 15-minute history, which is the hidden histories that you don't see in the guidebooks, that you don't see when you're walking around the village. And another thing that Phillips was witnessed was in 1819, when the riots took place in Manchester. He was present at the riots that were recently portrayed in a very good film a few years ago. And he was witnessing that with his wife's cousin, who was the owner of Style Mill, which you may have visited. It's a National Trust visit, just Quarry Bank, just outside of Stockport there. So although Abbeycwmhir is a remote area, you think it's cut off from the rest of the world. Down the years, down the centuries, there have been events taking place which have affected people who lived here and who had connections with there as well. So that was Francis Phillips. The building itself, say, was the school for a little while, not for very long. It lasted as the school until 1868, when the Phillips family, of course, who owned absolutely everything, moved the school 300 yards down the road that way, because the squire's wife, Anna Theophila her name was, found the children playing on the yard here next to the hall very noisy and very tiresome. So they simply moved the school down the road, out of earshot. Well, I'm sure you could still hear the children. There was never very many children at the school when it closed in 1970, early 70s. There was only 30 children there. So step inside. So they had a redundant building, and what were they going to do with it? Well, fortunately they didn't demolish it, because it's a rather nice building, very classic of its sort. So at the about 1860s as well, they were expanding the hall. They were making that much bigger. If you've been inside the hall when it was open, you will know it has a large number of rooms. Is it 52 rooms, one for every week of the year, rather nice. And they didn't have a laundry. So they'd converted the school into the laundry, and that's what its function was for decades following from that, right up into the 20th century. And this place, although it's called Cross Cottage, is always known in the village as the laundry. The name lives on. So there are various uses for it. We'll go into the church next, have a look at the yew trees on the way. The one on our left is reckoned to have had an age of at least 500 years, and the one on the right, several people have assessed it, and I'm not quite sure how you assess the age of a yew tree, apart from doing dendrochronology, which is the sort of thing we do with timbers in buildings to find out how old they are. 1,000 years possibly on that one. And I believe you can often tell how that a tree is very ancient, a yew tree is very ancient, because it starts to hollow out inside as the annual rings expand and the tree gets bigger, they tend to separate inside. And the very famous one in Scotland, which is completely hollow, but stays in place. And the yew tree could be very significant when it comes to the location of the Abbey, which we'll see a little bit later. And we've got a nice little painting that was done back in the 1850s of a different church to this one. The entrance was round the other side of the railing there, across the little bridge there, and then the path that runs diagonally across the churchyard, because of course this was the school playground. Anyway, this is the Lich Gate, which was built around 1900, and it was built as a memorial to Mary Beatrice Phillips, who died in 1898, and it was built as a token of appreciation, we are told, by the workers on the estate, and it would have been built by the estate craftsmen as well. It's a little bit of repair work in recent years, but it's basically original and stood there for a long time. Very much a feature of country churches, and it had served a specific purpose. The main object of the exercise with the Lich Gate was not actually to prettify the churchyard. What you did is assembled the bearers and the hearse before a funeral, and when it was time to go into the service and conduct the funeral arrangements, they moved off from the Lich Gate. But they had a purely practical purpose originally. And this is obviously the churchyard. We're not quite at the right time of the year, and our grass cutters are, as you can see, super efficient, but we get some wonderful small mats of small fungi on the churchyard up here, just growing in the grass. And I forget the name of them, but they are quite
white wax caps.
Yeah,
wax cap fungi. Yeah.
Just little ones. And different colours, orange and purple ones, and white ones.
A number of these are now thought to be internationally important. So
yes.
A churchyard like this, sort of jokingly claimed, has the equivalent of a blue whale, a giant panda, a snow leopard, and possibly a Bengal tiger, all in the same.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful.
Internationally important, but they love this very short turf.
Yes, yeah.
A lot of conservationists hate.
Yeah, you can't win, can you, really?
Yeah. Doomed either way.
We're doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. Anyway, I'm keeping an eye on the time because we don't want to be here half the night as well. This is the older, we think the older of the two trees, certainly probably 800 years, which means that it was here when the monks from Whitland arrived to found a new abbey here in about 1170, 1176. So from a religious point of view, the yew trees are significant. I blame school history for a lot of misconceptions about history. We always learned at school, when I was at school, which seemed back in the Stone Age sometime, that the yew trees were in the churchyard so as people could make bows and arrows with them, particularly the arrows. We'd have to make a hell of a long time to make some arrows because they grow very, very slowly, as we know. The significance of the yew tree is more likely to come from a hermit who took up residence here, perhaps in sort of mid-medieval times, somewhere around in the late 1000s, 1100. There could well have been a hermit, sometimes called an anchorite, who lived here in a rudimentary shelter or a little cave or whatever, hollowed out cave, and just practiced his religious feelings in a very, very remote area. And they planted trees of this sort, yew trees, because they had a religious significance. And that religious significance, like other aspects of Christianity, goes right back to pagan times. And where did the anchorite come from? Where is he likely to have come from? It's quite possible that he came all the way from St Harmon, which is about 6 miles away, because St Harmon was a very important centre of Christianity in early times. If you've been to St Harmon, you will know that the churchyard is almost perfectly curvilinear, and the church sits on a little raise within that churchyard, and if you look around at the inside of the wall, you can see the remains of the old llan, the enclosure. That's what the llan is. Sometimes people think llan means church. It doesn't, it means enclosure. And you can see some of the old enclosure earthworks inside the wall of St Harmon. So we know it was a very early site. And the early Christians, and we're looking around 700 AD, built on the site of an already existing religious significant place. So we think that there was a religious practice at St Harmon before the arrival of Christianity. So we're looking at Christianity over the best part of 1500 years and a significant site before that. And as I was saying when we started, there was always somebody in the landscape before you, and so we trace back. And St Harmon was what is known as a class church. And that means that there were a number of priests, monks, and lesser orders who operated from that church site and then went out into the surrounding area, ministering to people, making contact, spreading the word. So it's possible that the anchorite, a hermit, came from St Harmon down here and lived a very isolated existence. But when the Cistercians arrived in the 12th century, they were looking for a site that already had religious significance. And so that could be a possibility. We can't prove it, there's no documentary evidence, but that is a way in which it works. And there are only 3 class churches in Radlison, Glaisbury, and you can pick it up in the name, and Glascombe. So if you go through Glaisbury near Hay, or walking around in the lovely hills around Glascombe, you're on the site of a class church. And one of the townships of St Harmon, that's the areas into which the parish is divided, is called Clasgarmon still, and as appears in the tithe survey in the 1840s, it occurs in the census returns in Victorian times as well, so the names persist. So that is a possibility that there was religious significance before the Abbey and before there was a church on this site. This is the second church on the site here. This one was built by the Phillips family in their munificence in the 1860s, 1866. The previous church probably sat on this flatter ledge that you can see just below here. And inside I've got a photograph of a painting that was done by a lady called Mary Layton about 1850. So Mary Layton and her brother, who was a vicar, who were friends of the Phillips, who were very keen on promulgating the church. And her brother had been invited to take a service here, and Mary sat outside painting the church while he was inside taking the service. Now, either she'd heard all his sermons before, or they were so damn awful she stayed outside. But anyway, she over time produced a lovely collection of paintings, watercolours of churches where she was outside painting and he was inside taking the service. So there we are. The church itself is a good example of its sort. It was designed by somebody called John Wilkes Poundley, and Poundley was an architect who lived at Blackhall, Kerry, up into Montgomeryshire. He also practiced in Liverpool as well. I suspect, but by and large, he made more money out of his Liverpool practice than he did out of his Kerry one. But he designed the church here, and he was also responsible for the enlargement of the hall next door, which we shall come across a little bit later on. The church is modelled on a church in Brittany, where they have these towers, and several of Poundley's churches have that sort of tower. the plan and appearance at a glance of Sarn Church, which is not far from Kerry. Looks very much like this one, same sort of tower, but less elaborate. I think they must have done a cut price version for Sarn. Obviously, to build that at the time was quite expensive. And over the door you see a tympanum, which is a copy. It's based on a view of the Ascension, and there is a late medieval tympanum that survived somehow or the other with the church ruins, which is now in the wall of the garden down there. Quite whether the Cistercians actually had the tympanum or whether it was brought here at a later date, because they didn't usually bother with that sort of thing. But that one is obviously Victorian, when the church was built in 1866. And some elaborate pillars as well. So I'll take you inside, just give you a brief outline of it. The great glory of the church is the stained glass, which you're not going to get the best effect from today because it's cloudy. We had all these lovely days when the sun was shining and the glass absolutely glowed. But I'll talk to you a little bit about the interior before we sort of move on, of Mary Leighton's painting, which shows what the church looked like before. If you have ever been to Reelton Church down near Abbeycwmhir, it would be very much like that. I'll leave that photograph there and you can have a look at it. Right, so this is the Victorians' take on the church. The little church that was here, they said was falling to bits, and so they needed to replace the whole thing. But in fact, the previous squire, who was called Thomas Wilson, left written records that the church as he found it when he came needed attention, and it was his priority to get the original church sorted out. So he put a new ceiling in, he supplied an organ for it, he gave that painting up there, which is a copy of an old master, and the place was tickety-boo. But it didn't suit the Phillips, particularly in the 1860s. I mentioned Anna Theophila Phillips, the lady who got the school moved. Her father was vicar of Stockport for 47 years. So there was sort of built-in churching within the family. And the Church of England, because everything was, the Church of Wales didn't exist before the 1920s, it was all part of, the Anglican Church was all part of the Church of England, was going through a sort of upheaval in the 1860s. You might have heard of something called the Tractarian movement or the Oxford movement, had various names, but it was an attempt to revive churches as they would have been in pre-Reformation times. So they wanted to put the clock back several hundred years and have a different form of service, much more like, as we would understand it, the Roman Catholic liturgy and the building that goes with it. So whilst from a casual observer's point of view, this is a church, a complete thing, it actually comes in different sorts of stages. You tend to find always with the church of mid-Victorian times and the Anglo-Catholic revival, as it was called, the font will be very near the door, either right by the door, like this one is, or just opposite as it is in Rerda Church, if you pop in there. And that was a sign of welcome to the new Christian. The baptism in the church was important, so that's what you'll find. The nave of the church is comparatively plain. The tiles on the floor are plain quarry tiles, nothing unusual about that. In this church you do have the benefit of a not quite so cold floor under the seat, so you have a bit of a wooden floor there. But then as you go further eastwards to the other end of the church, so the decoration becomes more elaborate. And again, this is part of the idea of the Catholic churches, the Orthodox churches, where the focal point of the church is the sanctuary in the chancel at the far end. So you will see when you get to the chancel arch, which is very much an import into Welsh church architecture, early Welsh Christian churches tend not to have a chancel. They don't have a big arch at that point there. The church ends there. So you can see around the chancel arch, there's some quite elaborate carving. It's what's called stiff leaf carving, and actually picks up on what we think, what we know the Abbey church contained before it was destroyed at the dissolution, that sort of carving. So it's getting a little bit more opulent. You see there's some polished marble built into it as well. And then when you get down there, you can see the diamond tiles in the steps, and the floor is a little bit better than this, quite a little bit better than this. And it's up a level. And then you go on towards the altar rail, where there are more steps. So it goes up another level. And the tiles there are more opulent. And you can see around the back of the altar table, quite elaborate and good quality tiling on the wall of the church. So that important focal area of the church is more opulent, better decorated, more sacred than these areas out here. If you go into a lot of early churches, so some of you might have been into Llanano Church, for example, you've got which isn't an early church itself, but it has a wonderful screen in it. And Abbeycwmhir Church has screens. A lot of our local churches have these. Old Radnor, I think, has a good one as well from memory. And the idea was that the priests performed their duties really out of sight of the congregation. And that preserved the mystique of the ceremony. And in some churches you'll see little squints built into the wall, so you could look through to the altar. And certainly before the Reformation, the priests did everything away from the eyes of the congregation. That was again part of the ceremony. And the Victorians were rather inclined to go back to that sort of almost exclusivity in worship and conduct of services. That's not what we're used to today. Over the arch there you have a rood, which is the crucifixion, obviously, with John, the disciple who Jesus loved, on one side, Mary on the other side. And that's really just a hint of the earlier medieval type of screening, which were very, very elaborately carved pieces of work. The stained glass, as I said, was really the glory of this church in my view. The apsidal windows at that end, the east end, are by glassmakers, London glassmaker called Heaton, Butler and Bain, who were the foremost glass manufacturers of Victorian England, including royal warrant for Queen Victoria herself. They were said to have produced something like 86,000 church windows between about 1840 and the outbreak of the First World War. So it is really very high quality glass. That's just about the best fittings that you could get in a church. And do go up and have a look at those when I've stopped. And the west window here is a rose window, very obvious. Not many rose windows like that in Radnorshire. And in the centre, you've got the four gospel writers, and then the 12 disciples round that, and Mary in the centre. This window is a little bit later than these, and it was built to the memory of one of the Phillips family, again, mid-Victorian times. So that is Abbeycwmhir Church today. So do you have a few minutes to go and look at particularly that end and the windows? The one on the half right there, a representation of the very famous Holman Hunt Light of the World painting. So it is significant glass. I hope you don't see the bit where It's dropped out. The veneration to the east is quite interesting as well. That's a hangover from pagan religion. It's quite a good spot just here because we're at sort of bridging point between the old and the new. Obviously this is the hall. They don't actually want us going in today. They've locked the gates. Well. All of this land was part of the home grange of the monastery, and it extended originally to from here to very much the far end of Llanbaden, Eskidranllwyn and beyond, where you go out, if you know the Leithdy Road, where you get right out onto the new town road. The monastic grange was 10,000 hectares. It's a hell of a lot of ground. None of the sub-medieval, sub-monastic estates were anything like that sort of size. But the interesting thing with the first of these, which is the Fowler estate, William Fowler built quite a lot of things. He was very much involved with the estate, but what they did not have was a big house. You expect a big estate to have a big central house, which has always been there. And in the case of some particularly English rural estates, that is very much the case. There is an obvious big house at the centre from which the estate is managed. The Fowlers were largely absentee landlords, and so was their successor, Thomas Wilson. So there was no big house here until the coming of Wilson, who was buying land here in the 1820s, 1824, 1828. And probably about 1830, he decided to build a house here on the site of this house. And we're told from the sale documents that arose in 1837 after Wilson had got involved in a property deal in London with Lord Portman and gone bust, that his house was a large 4-bedroomed house in the Elizabethan style. That's what his written record of it is. And he cited it up here because he wanted to include the Abbey ruin as part of his garden, what we would call in garden history terms a romantic garden. How romantic it is in the Abbey in the middle of the winter, anybody can judge. Those of us that live here know anything but romantic. But that was his plan. So he built a house there, nothing like the size of the one that's there at the moment. But that was the first big house on any of the Abbeycwmhir estates. So what did the Fowlers do? Well, up until probably the time of the Civil War, they were able to use a house that survived from the Abbey ruins, probably the abbot's lodging house. And there's some evidence that there was a very big house, well, not a very big house, but a solid house, probably down here somewhere roughly where the home farm is today. And there's a record in the Civil War of the parliamentarians arriving at Cwmhir Abbey and laying siege to Mr. Fowler's big house. And the siege lasted it seems all of an hour and 20 minutes, and it was all over. I can't quite understand why the Fowlers bothered to arm a house down there in the bottom of the valley. You've got high ground all around, they can pop off it due to their heart's content. Truth is the first casualty in any war, as we know. And I think possibly the parliamentarians rather over-egged the success of taking Cwmhir just to suit their own purposes. Especially as in those days this road didn't exist. There was no road up the valley. You got up here by simply going on tracks from farm to farm and worked your way up the valley that way. This road was laid out as a joint venture between Thomas Wilson and John Cheeseman Severn of Penabont Estate. again around 1830, 1828, 1830, because Penybont Estate had some farms down there, as did Wilson, so it was a common good sort of thing. But what Wilson also did was to clear the Abbey site because he wanted it for his garden, and heaved up a lot of things from down there, levelled the garden with it, and brought the road up here. So I suspect the best artefacts remaining from the Abbey are under the road here somewhere, and we have very little to go. Most abbeys, you've got lots of things. You go down to Dore Abbey, where I was the other day. There's bits of stonework, decorative work, any amount of it surviving, but very little of it here. But anyway, Wilson built up the road there, built the house there. When the Phillips came, the house was deemed not big enough. They bought the house in the estate in 1837. They did not appear on the census until 1851, and then shortly after that, in the 1860s, they enlarged the house. So somewhere in the core of that house is Wilson's house. They didn't demolish, but just built around it, as is very often the case if you're looking at house history. So that then produced this house of 1,000 rooms or whatever it is, and they laid out the garden. The Phillips family, I think, also planted these beech trees up there, which are rather nice. That's it. Now, I want to take you to look at that in a little while. If you don't mind a walk down to the mill bridge, we'll go down the road rather than through the wood. It's a bit safer at the moment. And then walk back across the fields to the Abbey, if that's all right with you, and tell you a little bit about that. Because this is not the bridge that was built when the road was built back in about 1830. The bridge that was here was swept away by a huge flood in 1931. Took out this bridge, the Divana Bridge, and the Cuckoo Bridge was the next one down again. And what had happened, the monks' fish pool, which was up the valley towards Buckasani, had survived, unbelievably, all that time. Thomas Wilson, around 1830, had repaired it, raised the level of it a bit, so there was a nice monk's fish pool, and it is a genuine monk's fish pool, as opposed to a number of others around here which are called monk's pools but aren't. Great stuff. I don't know whether it had a lot of rain in 1931, but anyway, the dam burst and a great torrent came down, and this fish pool is about 2 miles away, up into the hills, and rushed down here. The bridge by my house, which we call the school bridge, escaped, which was fine. Because it's a super bridge. It's a lovely feature to have in your garden, really. You pay tens of thousands for it from one of these gardening experts. But it came on down here, took this bridge out and the next two. So climate problems are not new in the landscape, and certainly caused a bit of damage here. And it's the only time within memory that there was any record of extensive flooding right across this valley. We do get some flooding still, but not on that sort of scale. So that's why the bridges have changed. What I really came down to look at is the long, low building, which you see in front of us. We can probably walk up a little bit. And this part of the village is known as Frogtown. Nobody knows why. But the building itself we know as Tradesman's Row. And that dates again from the late 1820s, when Thomas Wilson was building up his estate here. And it was, what he was trying to do was improve the estate, which had been in serious decline over the Fowler's ownership, which started really in the middle of the 18th century. And so there'd been a long 60, 70-year period of decline, really serious decline. And at that time, in the early years of the 19th century, farming was buoyant. While farming was picking up, we'd had the Napoleonic Wars, there was great demand for food and so on. And so farming was good, and people with money who were coming from towns. Wilson wasn't a farmer, he was a barrister, but he had money to put into the land, and that was seen as a good investment. And they were always known as improvers. He employed somebody called Leighton Cook, who was really a land agent, plus agricultural advisor and all that sort of thing rolled into one. Do a survey of the estate, make recommendations where all the improvements could be carried out. And one copy has survived, which we still have. The Radnorshire Society have it in their library. And it is a fascinating handwritten document, beautifully written by Leighton Cook. And it did have a map with it, which has got separated, but we do have a map of that time as well. So they were agricultural improvers, and to do that you had to run the estate efficiently. So it was considered that if you had all your tradesmen in one place, you would be able to develop properly. So at that end was the smithy. That house is known as the smithy, that's what it's called. So the blacksmith was there. He would have been making all the ironwork for the estate, everything from screws and nails up to brackets, hinges, cart fittings, rims for the wheels, and etc., etc. The estate had to be self-sufficient. Also within that row was the cordwainer, who was both a harness maker and the cobbler, really, making boots and shoes. There was nowhere else to get any boots and shoes for miles around. So a number of trades were represented there. As well as that, there was the parish poorhouse, which sounds a bit patronising by modern terms, politically incorrect. Of course, there was no social services, no social security in the early part of the 19th century. So there was a very small, basically one room up, one room down, residence within that long row. And that went to somebody who was basically destitute and couldn't have a home anyhow else. So that's the sort of social services side of the estate as well. Then just at the end of this entry up here stood the mill, the Abbeycwmhir mill. And that was probably on that site for hundreds of years, because almost certainly we're at the back of the monastery here. That was where the monastic mill was located, right from the early days, and there was evidence. We found some good parch marks in 2018. It was actually better than this summer, of a building there, which was probably the drying kiln for the grain and so on. So that mill was functioning in its various manifestations right up into the 20th century, and was finally demolished in 1996. So it was an important feature of the monastic life of the community, and also obviously the later life. The miller didn't do a full-time job. He rented the mill, actually. He was a tenant to the mill, so it was up to him to run the mill as a business. But he had about 25 acres of land on the hillside above here, which he farmed as well, so both as a subsistence farming at various times, and also sell some of the crop off to make a profit as well. So it was always fairly businesslike. And if you look at other mills in the area, in Radnorshire, they all operated on the same way. When I first started looking at it, well, why has this miller got 35 acres of land? And the penny dropped that he wasn't milling full time. He was only milling part of the year and had to make a living at other times. So land came with the mill. So it was a great loss to the village. But so the rest of the row, we were seeing about half of it there. So the other half, because if you want to wander just down to the corner and have a look, that's no reason why you shouldn't. And then we will go through the farm field gate here and walk back up onto the Abbey. Anyway, here we are. Here's the Abbey at last, and again, a warm welcome. This is the nave, obviously, if you know the parts of the church. With nave there, chancel up here. The length of the nave is 75 metres. I think that works out at 243 feet in real money. And it is the largest nave of any church in the British Isles. It is just about the largest nave of any church in Europe. Why they built such a big church, nobody knows. That's one of the mysteries. With all mysteries in this particular church. So, what happened to it all? Obviously, there appears to be a bit of a break here, because we're standing in what would be the crossing. These walls would be the transept walls. They would square up and the chancel would go on down there. Now, how do we know what was going on? Well, we don't really. We're not sure. One of the mysteries of Abbeycwmhir is whether the church was ever completed. It was being built on an absolutely massive scale. So 75 metres on the nave. That would make it slightly bigger than Durham Cathedral. It would make it bigger than Winchester Cathedral as well, but just about the biggest. Quite a bit bigger than Westminster Abbey. In the middle of nowhere? What was going on here? Who built it? Was it one of the Welsh princes? Did they have the finance? Did they have the clout to get the materials? The more likely solution is that it was probably the Mortimers who were building it, the Mortimer Lordship, people who were supposed to be keeping things in order in this part of the world and on behalf of the King, Henry III. So we don't really know for sure whether it was completed. A good observer of the scene around 1840, which is just about the time of the dissolution, was a chap called John Leland. And Leland embarked on a journey around England and Wales looking at buildings, and he was interested in building because that was his job. He was the chief building advisor to Henry VIII, and by and large his reports are known to be very accurate. A lot of people writing at that time would have said what the king wanted to hear, because that would have been a lot safer. But anyway, Leland came around 1840, 1839, looked at the nave and recorded it as a huge and sumptuous building. Right, so we know that was all complete, all up and running, just about the time of the dissolution. But he then goes on to say that he was a little bit mystified because the chancel appeared to have not been completed. He could find the footings, the foundations, and the walls were raised up so high, but did not appear to have been built in its entirety. So it is quite possible that the church was never completed. It's a slightly unusual situation. It wouldn't be unique in being the only Abbey church, monastic church, not to be completed. Some of you may know Tally Abbey, which is near Llandailo, Tarallachai, and that is not complete because the benefactor of the abbey fell out with Edward I, lost his castle at Dynefor and all his wealth, and so the church was never completed. But they did build the East End, because that was the area with the altars and where all the worship took place and the sacraments were carried out. That was important. That's the bit they built first. So you've got an East End at Tally, but not a West End. Only some stumps of the pillars that they started but never finished. If you go to Anthony Priory, which was completed, and look at the styles of architecture, you'll find the East End is what we call Romanesque. It's basically a Norman sort of style, round pillars, round arches. But as you go further up the church west, it's the early English style. So they started with the East End and then built that. So quite why these monks or their benefactors built the church back to front and then abandoned it, we don't know. We're not even sure what happened. We've really only got Leland's report on what was going on here. You could work it out, because these sorts of churches, Cistercian churches, were often built on a proportion of 3 to 1. And that works very well. As I took some time when I had, of course, absolutely nothing else to do but come down here with my tape measure and measure everything. It's 75 metres that way, it's 25 metres that way. So it's a proportion 3 to 1. If you take the walls of the transept, it's 1/3 of the opening here. So from that you could work out where the rest of the church went, and it would stop just about on the fence line. So absolutely enormous, and then an ambulatory around it. And the what we call the claustral buildings, which is where the monks lived and worked, were always on the south side. So the cloister would have been here, with not with the electric supply in the middle of it, but in that area there. The chapter house, we think, was probably just beyond here, and the dormitory and refectory over there, further towards where they're running out towards the tree there. So it is possible to conjecture, and we've got some parchmark photographs from 2018, some aerials, which appear to show things going on there. They do also appear to show things going on here, but even if they only built the foundations and started the walls, that would still show on the parchmark. But 25 years ago, CPAT did a geophysical survey on this area, and it was very inconclusive. So it didn't show, but it often doesn't. A couple of years ago, I was down at Shaftesbury, and the Abbey there doesn't have an east end, but it's because, like here, the stone in the area is so awful for building. An abbey is a very good source of good building stone, and there the stone had been grubbed out right down into the ground, and even at foundation level there was nothing left. So it's quite possible that stone has been taken from this end, but we find no trace. What we could do, although I think it's probably not worth it, is do some sample trenches across a certain point. And you have to be very clever to do this. You have to look at the lithography of the soil that you're pulling out, and different grain size and all that. It gets quite technical, and you could possibly see where lines of excavation had been to make foundations. That said, a lot of Cistercian churches were built on very, very poor foundations. And some work was done by a chap called Larn way back in the 1950s, and then redone much more recently, which suggested that for many Cistercian churches, the foundations were only about 15 centimetres deep. It was extraordinary. They trigged out a ditch about that sort of depth where they wanted to build. They laid pebbles in the bottom of that, put a bit of gravel on top of that, smoothed that, and then started to build up the stones on top of that. So it was just the sheer weight of the church and the interlocked stones that was holding everything up together, and probably goes quite a long way to explain why Abbey churches, and indeed other churches of that period, fell down with such enthusiasm, because collapses of churches, buildings were common. The great Norman tower at Ely Cathedral, which was an abbey in those days, collapsed in 1322. Tons of masonry crashing down. So falls were possible. So it's possible that some catastrophic fall had taken place at this end of the church, although there's no written record of that. So it's really a matter of speculation as to what was going on. Anyway, the building itself was done by teams of itinerant workers. The masons were incredibly clever people, as I said just now, and very accurate in their laying out of the site. And the master mason was responsible for all the laying out on the site work. And they would start with the south wall, which was the one on that side in this context, and lay it out very accurately. The ideal was to get it on an east-west axis. This one is actually in common with a number of other Cistercian churches in Wales, slightly off-key of that. This one is not quite east-west, and that may well be due to the limitations of the site. Tintern Abbey is north-south because of the narrow shelf alongside the River Wye that it's built on. So this one is about, I think, 9 degrees out, but it has certain symbolic results. The idea of the east-west axis was that the sun shines in the east window on the Midsummer's Day. So there again you have a link with what actually is a pagan. What are they doing down at Stonehenge but waiting for the sun to rise over the east end? Being offset slightly, as this one is, you find that the sun shines directly in the west window or the west door on the autumn solstice, so equinox rather. So how deliberate was that? And that is the case in quite a number of Cistercian churches in Wales. Somebody asked me where the monks came from. Just the answer for everybody's benefit. Abbeycwmhir was founded by the monks of Whitland. Whitland had been founded by monks coming from Cîteaux in France in 1143, and then it was the job of the monks to get their religious house up and running, basically, and then send a detachment of people off somewhere else to start another monastery. It's also the sort of equivalent of the modern idea of church planting. So you get one going, then once that was up and running, send some people off to start another. And they were known as daughter houses. So this was a daughter house of Whitland, which was really the sort of master centre for all of the mid-Wales monastic setups, like Strata Florida would include in that. The daughter house of Abbeycwmhir was at Cummer, at Abbeycwmhir, founded just short of 1200. And they moved from place to place. So they had quite a network of monasteries, and they were not all that far apart. We tend to get the idea that the Cistercians always lived in isolation. In fact, they were on quite a good routeway here, and the abbeys were really only 25-30 miles apart. So if you started somewhere like Margam or Neath, you get to Whitland, you get to Strata Florida, you get here, you go to Strata Marcella, you go to Valley Crucis, and finish up at Basingwork. You have a whole network of line of Cistercian houses, mostly only 25-30 miles apart. So it was not perhaps quite so important to be in an isolated position. This might be the idea of St Bernard, who founded the movement, but it didn't actually work out. It was suggested that the abbey here was founded in 1143, but that I think would have been impossible because 1143 was the foundation of Whitland, so they couldn't be founding two abbeys at the same time. And I would include in the Whitland family, as it were, Dore Abbey, which I visited the other day, because although that was founded by monks from Moramont in France, it effectively was managed by Whitland, the important monastery of the area. If you look at the stones, you may find a mason's mark here and there. Each mason had his own mark. It was a matter of pride that he put his mark on the work that he'd done, but it was also probably a method of paying him, because he was paid by the stone, and so he put his mark on. They were like batch marks, really. And all the workers worked in teams. Of great importance was the carpenters as well, and their responsibility was to erect this incredible scaffolding that was put up. No sending for SGB or Brecon scaffolding or whatever. It was all made on site from wood and had to be very secure to carry the weight and the safety angle. In some of the walls you can still see putlog holes where the horizontals were trapped into the stonework as you went, and then when things were finished they were either cut off, or if they could be pulled out then a stone was put in to seal that up. There was a door here, probably coming in from the cloister, another one further down that end, which was probably the monks' night entrance to come from the dormitories, which would be in that area beyond there, and come down to this interminable round of services every day, and they didn't get much sleep at all. Here we have the commemoration of Llewellyn ap Griffith, who died at Kilmary at the hands of, we're not quite sure who really, but there was this strange battle that took place at Orwell Bridge down there, 1288. Quite what was going on we don't really know. Some suggest that faced with the possibility of getting a peace deal with the English, that drew Llewellyn there. We don't really know. Why they had a battle on the 12th or 11th of December is a mystery, because it was way outside what we call the fighting season. There was a certain set season for battles in medieval times because of the daylight. Battles were a long drawn out affair, and of course the weather as well. So what was going on is just another mystery. But it is thought that Llewellyn's body was brought to Abbeycwmhir for burial. The Cistercians in Wales were very sympathetic to the cause of the Welsh princes, and so that makes sense. It was certainly one report that said Llewellyn had white monks with him, white priests, at the time of the battle as well. So it's quite reasonable that he was brought back here. And there's two letters, at least, quite angry letters from the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, who was John Peckham, to the Archdeacon of Brecon, demanding to know why he had allowed Llewellyn to be buried at Abbeycwmhir, where he could be the focus of further insurrection and trouble. We don't have the answers to these questions, but there are those who say no, he most certainly wouldn't have been buried here. And they suggest that he was taken perhaps to Llantarnam, which is, well, roughly in the suburb of Cardiff these days, or maybe even to Bristol, much further afield, where he would not be a focus for further problems. Again, we don't know. What we do know from documentary evidence, the gory nature of the times, that his head was lopped off and taken up to Rhuthlan, where Edward I was billeted with his forces, just to prove that they had actually killed him. I'm sure there were other ways of doing it. And in common with the other traitors of the time, it's pretty awful times really, it spent some years on a spike outside the Tower of London. So, that was the way of those days anyway. And just a couple of other things while we're here, just keeping an eye on the time. On that side of the Abbey buildings, nothing to do with the Abbey, is a mound or a mount. Again, made by Thomas Wilson, so obviously no end of monastic artifacts buried in there as well. And that was part of a landscaping, almost certainly part of a landscaping effort to improve his garden. So I say he wanted all this as part of his garden. He built up the land a bit up there as well, as we were saying. He created the pond lake down here, which was stocked with fish, but I think the lack of water has put the kibosh on that. And what wasn't put the kibosh on by the weather has been done by the local otters. We have got otters here, so a little bit of natural history for you. And far too many mink, I'm afraid. They're a damn nuisance. And polecats as well. But going back to the mound, I said that it's what was known as a prospect mound, and it was much more a feature of big 18th century gardens than 19th century when this was being laid out. But you brought your guests down through for a saunter from the house, down through the ruin and up onto the mound, which is probably sort of naturally lowered a bit over the years, and then you could view your parkland. But if you want to know what the arcading really looked like, go to the church at Llynedloes, because in 1540 they were doing some work and rebuilding the church over there. So they purchased 5 bays from the crown, because the whole one of the main objects of the exercise was to raise money for Henry VIII. And so they built 5 bays and they re-erected them. They didn't use the full height of the pillars, but they've used the capitals and the basic pillar. And fantastic. We got some models of them in the exhibition room, actually. About to come to the end, there's a couple of things. I think I mentioned on passing earlier on that we were interested in this house and the cellar. The cellar is through the door underneath. And what is very strikingly obvious is the cellar is a complete misfit to the house, which makes us think that the cellar may well be from a medieval building that stood on this site before. And this would be the obvious place for the gatehouse. And so we're doing some investigations on that. We've got an expert coming to look at the stonework in there later in the month. And we gather that the garden is underpinned by a lot of stones. When you dig in the garden, there's lots of stones there. And we think that this was part of the gatehouse. The gatehouse would have been there. Another building parallel to it, so you had an arch between, and this would have been the entrance. It's all conjecture at the moment. Everything's conjecture with this, but that would make complete sense. And the almonry would have been there, where one of the functions of the monastery was to feed the local people who were in difficulty, or travellers and so on. Just to prove that recycling is nothing new. One of you spotted these pieces up there. I'm not sure how long they've been there, but so we had this painting, found this painting that's in the National Library, done just at the turn of the 18th century, 18th, 19th century, and the house looks very much as it does today. So although there's a date round the other side, which is I think 1806, no, it's earlier, because the artist was a Scotsman who'd emigrated to Canada, but came back for a painting tour between 1797 and 1799. So we have a fairly precise date as to when he painted this picture, which includes the ruin and included the house. I'm not sure if you couldn't see those pieces up there, and we think they look like part of the top of a pillar, but we think in fact they were probably little parts of a niche to put a statue on, and they were quite commonly found on gatehouses, which also adds to our little bit of building up the evidence that the gatehouse was here. Anyway. Beyond there, when you get out into the yard, jumping centuries to about 1850, we've got what's known as the home farm. Used to be the Abbey farm, going back historically. But this is a rebuild around 1850, and it is the model farm was the model farm for the estate. The influences for agriculture in Wales at that time were coming across the border, because land was being bought by people from across the border, and they would bring their ideas with them. And so it's an absolutely fantastic set of buildings, a real classic of its time, and listed. Wants a little bit of repair here and there, but looks good. And in one of the buildings on the left, the exhibition room, where you will see a life-size model of one of the capitals. If you want to have a look at it. The design is called stiff leaf. Not quite sure why. As I was saying to some of you who are near me down there are 5 columns from the Abbey in Llanidloes Church, because they bought them at the dissolution because they wanted to expand and do up the church at Llanidloes. And they're just absolutely fabulous. But the style evolves, and they were individual craftsmen. So although there are 5 capitals that you can see at Llanidloes, no 2 are exactly the same. Just good, unlike today's mechanisation where everyone would be machined and actually identical. So you get that individual. The stone that the walls were built was relatively local. There was an outcrop of decent stone at the top of the hill behind here at a place which is we call Fowler's Cave. It's not a cave, it's a quarry. And also some of the stone quarries just south of Rhoda have this sort of stone in, but most of the local stone is shaly and goes to pieces. The decorative stone, with the carved stuff like the capitals and so on, is a type of sandstone, which was widely thought to have come from Grinshill, just north of Shrewsbury there. But we're now doubting that because the stone that we have here has got mica in it. And the Grinshill stone does not have mica in it. And it depends on how it was deposited. It comes from the sort of Permo-Triassic period. And one in the Permian, the deposition was underwater. In the Triassic, it was not. And the difference is in the one you get mica and the other you don't. And Grinshill doesn't fit the bill. But it's the sandstones that you get on, say, the Epping, down beyond between Bilth and Leithwen, Brecon, would be the correct ones, and also some near Ludlow. So they actually transported stone over huge distances if the need was there. The idea that everything was locally sourced just is not so. To such an extent, I came across some of the stone in South Florida comes from a quarry at a place called Dundry, which is just south of Bristol. And that Dundry stone also occurs in a monastic building in Ireland. So distance was no object, basically. And if you look at some of the churches and abbeys of southern England, they're built of calm stone, which has come across the other side of the channel. So they were quite happy to move materials vast. In this locality, it all points to somebody like the Mortimers, who had the clout to get that organised, because you would need right safe passage if you were lumbering thousands of tons of stone by cart, ox-drawn cart, over whether it's 50, 60 miles from Shrewsbury, 40 miles from the Epping, or whatever. You're very vulnerable, so you need good passage. And I think probably the Mortimers were the only people who had the political clout to be able to get safe passage. So I may be wrong, because we're often wrong.